Kerrie.
Thank you.
Uh,
Look,
yeah.
we have got John Currie up at 3:30 in the morning,
Yes.
his time. So if it's all right with all the members and our guests, I would like to skip our reports for the moment, and we might come back after we have heard from our guests. So if that's all right with everybody, cool.
Yep.
So let me introduce John. John is president, as you've already heard, of the Rotary Club of Pickering in Canada, and is executive director of an organisation he's going to talk to us about today, honouring Indigenous peoples. He's also the cultural advisor to the City of Pickering, and Melissa Hebab and I have been working with John now for a few months, and we're really excited to bring him to you tonight and let him talk to you. So I'll shut up and hand over to John. Please make him welcome.
Good morning. Good morning. Thank you for having me. It is bright and early, for sure. Can I share my screen? That's okay. Here we go. Can everybody see that? Can everybody see that okay?
Yep.
We're good?
We can see that.
Good. Good. Thank you again for having me. HIP got started back in 2014. It was a number of Rotarians who got together and said, you know, we're doing this wonderful stuff as Rotarians do all over the world. And why aren't we doing something here for our Indigenous people? And that was the question that started our journey off, was what could we do here at home? And as I mentioned, Rotarians do this fantastic work. A couple important points about this slide is that we have 720 Rotary clubs in Canada, and there's over 23,000 members in Canada, which is a significant army when you want to do good within your own country. Our Indigenous people, when we started to look at this, we recognized that we have 633 First Nation communities. And when you look at it, you go say 720 Rotary clubs, 633 First Nations. What would it take to connect each of those Rotary clubs with one of those First Nation communities and begin the dialogue to happen? Obviously, you know, any place that had colonizing occur, there are certain challenges that have been created due to that, those actions. And we're about trying to move towards peace, move towards reconciliation, move to a better place than where we're at today. When we look at our Indigenous people across Canada, North America, from the Indigenous perspective, was actually called Turtle Island. And when obviously Europeans arrived, we rename everything because we felt that, you know, there wasn't any names that we recognize, but our Indigenous people recognize this as Turtle Island, and there's stories and history that go along with that. We had in the World War I, World War II, the Korean Wars, 1/3 of our First Nation people actually stepped up and volunteered to go to war. And that's a significant sacrifice on behalf of the Indigenous people. So it wasn't like that the Indigenous people were, you know, resistant to friendship, were resistant to working, you know, in partnership with the Europeans that arrived. They really were, and they're wonderful, wonderful people who have done fantastic things. When when Europeans first arrived here in Canada, it was Indigenous people that helped them survive. They taught them how to live on these very harsh lands. You know, we're in the fall, which is a beautiful time right now, and the colors of the leaves are all changing. But as we round the corner, the winters can be harsh. I myself am from Dryden, Ontario, which is about 20 hours from Toronto. And, you know, in the wintertime, the weather can be as low as 70 below with the wind chill factor. And to survive in these harsh climates, you really have to be prepared. Canada's history with Indigenous people has not been good, and it was never taught when you went to school. Oftentimes it was just, it was buried or not wanting to be spoken about. I grew up, as I mentioned, in Dryden, Ontario, and they had a residential school there, but even though the residential school was about 50 miles away from my house, it was never mentioned. It was never spoken about. In fact, I didn't hear about it until I was much older in life. And my father mentioned that when he was young, he grew up on a lake that had a school, and there was no road into the school. The school was actually on the far end of a lake. They always claimed that the schools were meant to assimilate or to integrate Indigenous people, especially the youth, into Canadian society, whatever that was to be. You'll see a picture on the bottom here of Thomas, and Thomas was an Indigenous boy who was taken away and put in a residential school. And this photo of him in his Indigenous dress, and then one in more of a European style dress, was a propaganda photo that showed, oh, we are assimilating these youth. But when you see the schools and you see where they were located, if you're going to assimilate someone, you would put them in the communities that they're to be assimilated to. McIntosh Residential School up near Dryden was on the far end of the lake. You could only get to it by boat. These youth were separated from their parents. They were taken from their homes. Many of them never saw their parents again. Many of them never left the school, and their deaths weren't recorded. They went missing. They would be buried in unmarked graves. There was, numerous tragedies that happened to these youth. One elder that, as I was going along my journey here, was speaking to me, and he said he felt guilty even today. He was standing on the shore, just a few steps away from their camp where they lived, with his brother playing on the shore, and a plane flew down, and it was RCMP officers, and they got out of the plane and they grabbed his brother, they put his brother on the plane, and the plane flew away. And this elder, when he was 4 or 5 years old, said he couldn't even scream. He was stunned, he was shocked, he was scared, and he felt guilty that he wasn't able to scream to help his brother, at least to notify his mom and dad to come down to the shore and try to help save his brother. The family never saw the brother again. His brother actually went to McIntosh Residential School that I mentioned, and the parents never ever saw them. They had these things we call reservations, and they were lands reserved for the Indigenous people after the treaty negotiations, because the land was needed to host settlers coming from Europe, as well as the railway, to do an intercontinental railway from coast to coast. And they kept moving where these reservations were, because maybe the first spot was inconvenient to them. They realized that they needed more land, so they would push the Indigenous people into harsher and harsher climates and put them in places where it was difficult for them to create a living for themselves. It's a very, very sad history. Even though when Europeans first arrived, the Indigenous people actually welcomed them. And you'll see this thing called the two-row wampum belt. The two-row wampum belt actually has 2 purple rows along it. And one row represents the Indigenous people of Turtle Island, and the other row represents the Europeans who were arriving. And they shared this wampum belt with the Europeans and said, hey, we will travel down the river of life together. We won't interfere with each other's way that we govern our people or our livelihoods, but we will share this land and the water and this space together as friends. And the one row represents the actual boat the Europeans came across in. The other one represents a canoe. When we talk about the history, it's not that long ago. The last residential school here in Canada closed in 1996. It's not that long ago. So we're not talking thousands of years. We're talking very recent. Many of the Indigenous people have intergenerational trauma, which is the fact that maybe 3 generations or 4 generations have actually attended residential schools. And after attending residential schools, well, lots of bad things happen in that sense. One, the parenting skills are gone. There's no, understanding of how they used to raise their children, because each time they were taken away to residential schools, so there was never an opportunity to be a parent. And Indigenous people here in Canada really cherish the relationships with their youth and with their children. And I couldn't even imagine at those times a whole community without any children whatsoever. And so you've lost parenting skills, you've lost, that family aspect. The culture has been lost because they weren't taught the culture. They weren't allowed to speak the language when they were at the residential school. They're just so everything just kind of has been destroyed by these people. And when you look at the United Nations, who have now declared that this really was an attempt to wipe out the Indigenous people, these are really, really challenging times now that we're going through, because although we call it truth and reconciliation here in Canada, the truth meaning understanding what actually happened, not this glossy picture of this romantic place of Canada where all these immigrants have come to. That was empty at the time. It wasn't. And understanding what really, really happened at the end of the day, and then trying to reconcile that as we move forward. I often feel that it should have actually read truth, healing, and reconciliation. As I mentioned, HIP was launched in 2014, and now we're rounding a corner. So even though racism has been identified as normal in some communities, there's lots of good things that are starting to happen. And I'm proud to say that Rotary is in the front of that. Connecting 720 Rotary clubs with 633 First Nations. We're about halfway there right now. So we have about 350 of our Rotary clubs working specifically with a First Nation community, and it's quickly growing beyond that. It's moving very, very fast. In fact, every day I get another call. After I'm done here, I have my own Rotary Club meeting, and then I'll be speaking on the East Coast, which has its challenges right now in regards to the fisheries. When Indigenous people signed the treaties on the East Coast, they had reserved the rights to fish and harvest lobster all year round. And that wasn't upheld by the government of Canada until about 10 years ago. And as that's now being upheld, it's created, and the lack of education by non-Indigenous people, it's created a conflict for the non-Indigenous fishers, who now are claiming that the Indigenous people are encroaching on their livelihoods as well, which is not a case. But with anything, as you're doing change, conflict definitely comes about. This is just a quick kind of picture of what HIP really is all about. When we started HIP, it was clear to us that if we're going to do anything that's in terms of real, true reconciliation, it had to be with Indigenous people. We're not Rotary doing charity for Indigenous people, which charity has its own challenges. And we've come across this term called toxic charity. Toxic charity is where you're constantly providing products or solutions, and never allowing the Indigenous people or whoever you're trying to help to come up with their own solutions, to find the root cause of why the need for the solutions are. And so when we formed our board, we actually made it 50% Indigenous and 50% non-Indigenous. The non-Indigenous, the 50% that's non-Indigenous right now, are all Rotarians. And that's part of our mandate as well, is to make sure that at least 50% of our board are Rotarians. Now it's interesting too, because as we've been going along this journey, we now have Indigenous people joining Rotary. And I really see that eventually at some point, this could be 100% Rotarians, even though it's still 50% Indigenous, 50% non-Indigenous. It could actually be 100% Rotarians as we move forward. We also took another step about a year and a half ago, and we said, you know, if we're going to be diverse, then it's important that we're also 50% women and 50% men. Many of the Indigenous communities before Europeans arrived actually were led by women. The women were the leaders within their communities, and so we came over, or Europeans came over, with a male-dominated type of approach, and actually started to appoint what we call today chiefs, and changed their whole structure on them. And they're just starting to restore some of those original governing ways of governing. Our board also stretches now from coast to coast. So we're right from the East Coast all the way to British Columbia. Our board is actually selected by, you know, very top-notch Rotarians and top-notch Indigenous leaders, and each is highly respected within their own areas of expertise. The coast to coast gives us a 360-degree view of what's going on. Now, we actually have closer to 60 distinct Indigenous nations. And it would be impossible for us to have a board with all of those different Indigenous nations represented. And so, although we have a board that governs HIP, we also have developed, or starting to develop and grow, an advisory board. And that advisory board is going to be made up of what we call district coordinators. So we have a Rotarian district coordinator for each district across Canada. And some of those districts actually cross over to the United States as well. And then we have Indigenous representatives from each of the treaty areas, as well as the different communities across Canada. Now, we haven't covered them all yet, but we're definitely growing that out so that we get a fair representation of what's going on. Our vision and our mission really is about connecting Indigenous and non-Indigenous people so that we work together, that we understand that we're interconnected. And although as we were going along, and it makes a lot of sense, our vision and mission, it makes even more sense today with COVID happening. There is more of a need for us to work together. There's more of a recognition that we are interconnected. I mean, not just Canadians and Indigenous and non-Indigenous, but all around the world, right? COVID has moved extremely fast, and it's changed the landscape on us. So there is a greater need for HIP today than ever before. And I like Ian Reisling's quote, you know, we work together because we can achieve far more together than we ever could by ourselves. And that's really what HIP is really about. We talk about 3 steps to moving forward. What we've learned anyways is the 3 steps to move forward. And keep in mind, when we started, our mindset really was on that toxic charity type of model. I think we stepped in it going, hey, what can we do? Can we solve the water problem? Can we solve a housing problem? Can we solve this? And we had this colonial thinking. Like, we were coming with that thought of, we're going to help save the Indigenous people. And what we have to realize is that Indigenous people are very intelligent, and there's a lot of knowledge that still has been passed down. And there's engineering knowledge, there's cultural knowledge, there's all sorts of wonderful ways that they have shared. I'll share a story with you. I took 9 students from Toronto to an isolated community called Moose Factory to meet 10 Indigenous students. And when we went there, the non-Indigenous students shared robotics knowledge with these Indigenous students. And there was no robotics program within the community that we went to in Moose Factory. And so this opportunity for these students up there to learn about robotics was a really big deal, a truly big deal. In exchange, to make sure that we keep the relationship balanced, these students up there taught the students from Toronto land-based knowledge, how to survive out in the land in these harsh climates. And they took them out on the water, and they took them out on the land, and they showed them how to different techniques of survival techniques and things like that. So and there was a historic aspect to it as well. But when the knowledge of the robotics was being shared, none of the Indigenous students had a pen or paper, and they just sat and they listened, and they listened for about 2 hours. And after the 2 hours, they said, okay, now it's time to start to program these robots. The students, Indigenous students, hopped in and they just started programming. They had never had any experience, any knowledge on robotics before. They just sat and listened. And it really indicated to me that there is there's a difference in the way that we learn, in the way that, we retain the information, the way that we get knowledge, and we have to respect those things as well. And that's part of this whole building of relationships, the learning and sharing, and then learning how to walk together. So instead of it being one-sided, that we're trying to always provide and make people, feel that they're reliant on whatever that charity might be, create situations where you've got this balanced relationship, where you're working on shared challenges and shared goals together. The building of the relationship is always the first step. It's not to go in with any preconceived notions. It's not to go there and say, hey, they need to do this. It's to go in there and just truly reach a hand out in friendship. And Rotarians are wonderful people. I mean, this is what we do with ourselves. We network all around the world. And, we're extremely friendly. It's easy for us to develop relationships. And that's why I see Rotary as a leader as we have this peace movement starting to move forward. It's easy for us. We do have these things called friendship centers across Canada, and the communities are all identified. There's always a listing now on the website to who's the leader of it. So we reach out and we just start that friendship. And many of the Indigenous community or friendship centers often have some sort of training now, or they might have some sort of cultural event. And we start just by going and getting to be introduced. When I first arrived on a few of the Indigenous communities that I wasn't familiar with, some of the chiefs here would say, what are you here to sell me? I wasn't there to sell them anything. I was there just to get to know them, to understand, to let them know that we're working within their community as well, and who we are. So really just spreading the word, creating awareness, and then learning about their specific culture, because each one is unique. And learning and sharing is really a big deal. Oftentimes when I go to Rotary clubs, especially along those areas that racism is normalized, and often people don't even realize that the racism is normalized. It's just as they grew up, this was normal for them, and they say the same negative comments that they've heard their parents say or their grandparents say, not realizing that there's some sort of negative aspect to what they're doing. We have sports teams here that are named the Indians in North America, or Chiefs, which is inappropriate to be with the logos being a cartoon type of Indigenous person, and using a tomahawk as a motion within the crowd. These things, including streets that are named Indian Street or Colonization Street, for example. These are just constant reminders of what the negative aspects of history have all been about, and holding down the Indigenous people. when Europeans arrived here, they actually thought they had reached East India. And so they named the indigenous people Indians inappropriately. It would be like calling an Italian Greek or a Scotsman Irish. It's an inappropriate label on the indigenous people here. And now that we're wise to it, we should be changing and adapting and identifying them in the way that they want to be identified. For me, for example, I live in what's called the Williams Treaty area, and the signatories of the Williams Treaty are the Mississaugas of Scugog Island First Nation. And as I was going along my journey, I did happen to recognize that the Scugog Island First Nation community had never been in touch with the city of Pickering. And so I thought we need to fix that. So recently, I've introduced the mayor to the chief of Scugog First Nation, and the city has actually started their journey along the path of learning and understanding about Scugog First Nation community, and allowing certain cultural aspects to also occur here within the city. The chief really truly appreciated us reaching out, and she's appreciated the fact that the city is on that journey, so much so that the city, or the Scugog First Nation chief, gifted a flag from their community to the city, and the city did a flag raising a few weeks back. It's the start of their journey. It's not by all the end, but it's the start of learning and sharing about each other and understanding. We hold these things called Change the Narrative, HIP does. Change the Narrative takes a short view of one of the episodes of First Contact. And First Contact actually originated from Australia. The first episodes occurred there. It was a producer that I know who thought this would be great to bring to Canada, and they've actually done 2 series here now in Canada. They take Indigenous and non-Indigenous, they take non-Indigenous people who have racist attitudes, and they put them in Indigenous communities, and they're challenged. Their beliefs and what they had learned or what people had told them all get challenged. And you see a number of these individuals who go on these journeys begin to change their attitudes and change their approach, and understand that this is a time for friendship and time for working together more so than any else. So we watch a 45-minute episode of one of those shows, and then afterwards we have an audience, usually try to make it 50% Indigenous and 50% non-Indigenous. And we usually have 3 local elders or chiefs on a panel, and they begin to answer questions in regards to the episode on how the situations within those episodes have impacted their life, or are they real to that community? Are they have they experienced something similar as well? The dialogue produces real change in people. You can see in non-Indigenous people, often some get uncomfortable, and then often start to realize that some of what they might have been, words they might have been using, or the way that they might have been approaching something is not the right approach. And it's not this where you're coming out and you're criticizing somebody specifically. You're just seeing it on the screen. And you're seeing behaviors that are not Rotarian-like. You're seeing behaviors that, just cause more harm than on building of relationships. So that's one of the things that we use here, but it's a good starting point in getting the dialogue going. Once then you've got a relationship started, and then there's that understanding of the truth. Then we begin to walk together. And what we do is we look for opportunities where you can bring community together, whether it's student-to-student engagement, like taking the robotics group from Toronto to Moose Factory, or whether it's a community Rotarians in a community working with a First Nation community. There's all these opportunities to find something where you might have a shared interest, or like the robotics might be a shared interest, or you might have a shared challenge. For example, the northern communities have shared challenges. They're isolated communities, so education, healthcare, the logistics of transportation, they share all of those problems together. Healthy and sustainable food. We all share water around the world, right? And that's something we can all work on together. But when we begin to start to work and create that dialogue together and share our resources, share our knowledge, wonderful things start to happen. And when they work over those shared challenges, that becomes the vehicle for ongoing relationship building. And they start to take their relationship to a whole new level. As I mentioned before, I often find that where the racism is coming from, or where some of these negative aspects are coming from, are from people who have never actually ever sat down with an Indigenous person. They've just heard about something, or they've just, something that they've reiterated from their parents, but they've never actually sat down with an Indigenous person. And when they do, and you start having that conversation, great things can happen. I was in Thunder Bay, and I introduced the president of the Rotary Club to the Fort Williams First Nation chief. And the president of the Rotary Club had never been on the reservation before. And he had this image of, very poor conditions and all the rest of it. And we do have some reservations that are like that are isolated. But there are a lot of First Nation communities that are doing good. They're finding ways to create funds for their community and do wonderful things. So when we first drove on, he goes, when are we going to be on the reservation? I said, well, we're already on the reservation. And he said, well, these houses look like my houses. Yeah, they do. And as we got further in and we met with the chief, and he was very, very nervous about meeting the chief, I simply just started to say to him, listen, just start to talk about some of the things that you're doing in Rotary. And as the president was talking, he said, a Rotary Club recently purchased a camp for disabled people. And, the camp was going to be going bankrupt, and the Rotarians came in and saved it. And the camp is designed in a way that you can get wheelchairs down the country pass. Like you can take a wheelchair into the wilderness, and you can take a wheelchair onto boats, or it makes a really accessible place. And the chief got excited because he said, listen, we have a lot of elders who have diabetes and other healthcare challenges who have never been able to get back out on the water or get back out into the land. Would we be able to host an event there with you someday? And Rotarian was shocked. He said, yeah, absolutely. We could do something together. And they did. They held an event where the Rotarians opened up the camp. The Rotarians were volunteering to help guide and tour people around the camp, drive the boats and all the rest of it. And the Indigenous community brought the feast. And apparently it was one of those moments for everybody of the two groups coming together. And it was a turning point within Thunder Bay, because up to that point, Thunder Bay was known as one of the most racist communities. And now what we have is Rotarians, many of them are business owners, putting signs up in their own businesses saying Indigenous people are welcome. And so, you get those friendships started, just those simple dialogues, holding a feast together, just getting to know each other. It went so far now that the whole community, which is the first Indigenous community, has joined Rotary, has joined that Rotary Club. And so it's kind of interesting to see this start to take on a life of its own. And we have to be careful and make sure that we're not, that we're only asking Indigenous people to join Rotary if it's right, if it's the right thing to do. And I think when you start to form those friendships, you'll start to understand that Rotary and Indigenous people are very, very similar. We both care about our community. We both want peace. We both care about the environment. We both care about mothers and children. We have so much in common with our Indigenous people that it makes sense for us to actually partner together and work together within our own communities. And when you're working together in those communities, it becomes that grassroots approach to reconciliation. Now, this is just a slide that I have as I speak to Rotary clubs. And, you know, I'm really happy to meet Carrie and Melissa. We met Melissa back, I think it was 2018 at the Rotary International Convention here in Toronto. We understand that we share a lot in common. And it's free, actually, to join HIP. It's not about trying to make money. It's about or even push our own agenda. It's really about, for us, sharing information. It's about wherever colonization occurred, there'll be people that have the similar challenges as ourselves, and we're all about sharing information. Now, it's interesting, just as connected as Rotarians are, our Indigenous people are connected as well. And so my board members actually have connections with Aboriginal people across Australia, and they share notes on non-Indigenous people all the time, and on their approaches as well. And so at some point down the road, as we're working with students, one of my visions would be that it would be great to have an engagement where we bring in Indigenous and non-Indigenous from Canada to Australia, and to meet an Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal in Australia, and vice versa, and have these engagements starting to go. I think that's something that Rotarians do extremely well with the exchange program, and I think that there would be a lot of advantage to sharing of all that information. Are there any questions for me? I mean, I definitely could go on for a full day, but I know we all have our limitations. So.
You might need to come off. This is such a fantastic presentation, Dean says. So I might throw to Dean if you would like to come off mute, Dean. It's your call, but for comment or question.
Yeah, that's amazing, the work that you've been able to achieve, and it's very interesting, and it's always enlightening when Aboriginal people around the world do share their stories. And for me to sit there and listen to you talk then was so engaging, so amazing. I am aware of the problems they were having with the inquiry for the murdered and missing women and the girls, particularly the Metai mob.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for sharing that knowledge. It's something that I'll treasure now. That's great.
Thank you, Dean.
So do we have other questions of John?
I've got a comment.
Mm-hmm.
I really appreciate your exchange program. I think that's a fantastic idea with the Indigenous people, the Aboriginals and your Indigenous people. I think that's a really good idea, and I would encourage that completely. Thank you.
I just really want to talk because I'm in awe of the presentation. Hi, John. I'm Jamison. I really love the comment about how Indigenous people learn differently, and I think it's so important. And I think something that's in the spotlight right now is the education of our Aboriginal students. And I think it's vital for non-Aboriginal students to be learning the Indigenous ways, the culture of this beautiful country. And I think that's so important. And I wonder if there's that sort of crossover, and if any experience you have in Canada and current education, I'd be interested in your comment on what happens there.
So over the last few years, the education system has worked towards bringing in more Indigenous content into the schools. The challenge has been that there's not a lot of Indigenous teachers. And where we do end up getting Indigenous teachers, they often want to, well, you know, rightly so, is to be focused on their own Indigenous students. You know, from a Rotary standpoint in Canada, it kept coming back time and time again for Rotary to focus on education and to support Indigenous education, not to create our own program for the Indigenous students, but to help support their Indigenous education. And what we recognize is that while while there's schools on the reservations and they're well equipped and they got the best equipment, there's a huge shortage of Indigenous teachers. And that's really important because everybody wants to see themselves, right? And if you have an Indigenous teacher in Indigenous community, then the students see themselves as being able to be successful. We need more of those type of role models to expand out. So it's such a shortage. But having said that, what we have done is that we create these things called circles. And circles are over a shared passion or shared interest. And I've got circles now, one on robotics, one on sustainable and healthy food, because that's definitely a challenge. And even with COVID now, that's even more of a challenge, is how do we get healthy and sustainable food out to remote, isolated communities, not just Indigenous, but right across Canada. And so bringing the students together over those shared challenges, they start to teach each other. And then we can supplement with experts. We have a lot of Rotary experts. I found this out really quickly, that when I put the word out, I go, hey, I need somebody on this topic. And same with the Indigenous aspect. There's a lot of elders who, because of Zoom, they might not be able to travel there, but because of Zoom, they can actually do an education program over Zoom. And so hosting these events just on something like sustainable food helps add to that education element. So it's not fully in the schools yet, but it's actually slowly getting there.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
Can I say something, Dean? It's
Yeah.
Lyndon Johnson here. What you just said and what Jamie said about the education and in school is, you know, that's the only way really in many aspects that you're going to get the new generations to accept, because of the heartache of their predecessors. So, the great thing is that it needs to be, their culture needs to be embraced. It needs to be respected. It needs to be taught and accepted in the with the white races.
Yeah, we have so much to learn from them.
We do. I grew up in a country where the Maori in New Zealand comes first. It's always been understood that it was their country, and the British had to buy it from them through a treaty. And they still have rights over and above the whites. We've had a Maori Prime Minister, and I think the woman that's in now, I think she's partly Maori. We educate our Indigenous people with respect, and they all have the opportunity to go to good schools and things like that if that's what they want to do. They have more benefits actually than what the white people do when you look at it through the government. And it's just amazing because they're always putting their culture out there. You can go to a football game, and I don't know whether you've heard of the All Blacks. But if you go to Eden Park and the All Blacks are playing, and I always say to people, if you go over to New Zealand for a holiday, you must go and see a game at Eden Park with the All Blacks, because they're talking their language in the seats. They're all, you know, yabby in a way. And they do the haka before the game, which is a challenge dance to the opposition. And the whites we all love it. We absolutely love it because I've grown up with it from day one, and it's in my blood, that Maori respect. Yeah. Because of who and what they are.
Lyndon, when Melissa and I met in Canada at a Rotary International conference that was had a panel that was an Indigenous panel. They had a New Zealand person on the panel, and there's no other word but revered for that particular elder and all the speakers. And there were a couple of really angry young Canadian ladies about what had happened to them in Canada. But when they spoke of New Zealand, it was always with respect about how well the country had looked after their Indigenous people in New Zealand. When they spoke of Australia, I was embarrassed to be an Australian in that audience. I was so embarrassed to be an Australian in that audience. It was with a lot of, and I'm really embarrassed that I went to school and I never learned anything about, I suppose I might have learnt something, but it was certainly not positive, that's for sure. And if it was given one class out of the entire lesson of, you know, my school career, I'd be surprised. And that makes me angry. That makes me angry that I didn't learn what I didn't know. What makes me even angrier is my daughter and son went to school and didn't learn much more. They did learn more, but not much more. And yet in New South Wales, there is a led to believe their Indigenous training in schools is better than ours here in Victoria.
Yeah.
So there's lots of work to be done nationally. HIP Australia is being formed, which I'm so excited about, and I really, you know, want to congratulate Melissa for bringing it to Australia. And I'll let you know, we've had probably, I'm going to say, half a dozen meetings now on a monthly basis. We're in the forming, storming, norming, we're in the forming stage, and we need to engage more with Indigenous people before we start developing missions or visions or things like that on our own in our white bubble. I'm not going to let that happen. Melissa and I won't let that happen. So we are engaging. I've spoken to Hayley McGuire and a few other people who are Indigenous and encouraging them to come along and be part of HIP Australia, because I think the model that John's got, I love it. I love that it's 50% male and female. I love that it's 50% Indigenous and non-Indigenous. And John, my question to you is, how long did it take to form a board 50-50 of Indigenous, non-Indigenous, etc., to get that board going? I'd imagine a while.
Yeah, well, you know, in 2014, it took 2 years to really start the board moving. And it was because we took our time, wanted to get it right, and want to listen to how the Indigenous people wanted to participate. In 2016, we had a small board. It was of 10 people. But we quickly realized that, and it was really specific to Ontario, the province of Ontario. It quickly realized that we had a lot more to share right across Canada. Our Indigenous people don't have the same boundaries that the colonizers did. Colonizers came in and said, "Hey, this is going to be the province of Ontario. This is going to be the province of Manitoba," and Indigenous people had different regions, and so those don't necessarily always line up. And even across the states, it doesn't line up. So, but to actually move from 10 to 20 was fairly easy because we had gained a reputation with the Indigenous people, which is really, really important to us. You know, we don't want to take a misstep, so we do not get involved in politics. We stay out of all of that. Each community has its own chief, and there's like close to 60 of them across Canada. Each of them have their own dynamics in that regard too. We don't get involved in ruling of those communities. Our job really is relationship building and helping bringing people together over shared challenges. Now, Carrie, you also mentioned something else, and this is what everyone goes through. As we have this realization of what happened, there's this feel of guilt, there's this feel of sadness, these feelings. It's important to recognize those feelings because that's that healing I talked about. So you understand the truth, you get this space of healing. And it's important not to blame. It's not, you know, we're not looking for blame. You're not looking to make anybody feel guilty or to be like that. It's important that to recognize that you weren't the one who created the problem. But it's also important to recognize that we are the people now that can actually solve the problem or work towards resolving that problem. And if we did nothing, then yeah, then we should feel guilty. But as Rotarians, we're not like that. We're action oriented. We're peace builders. We love international, right? And so the wonderful thing here is, from Indigenous to Canada, that's a nation-to-nation relationship, right? Because each Indigenous community is their own nation, essentially. And when you talk to youth, you don't have to. They don't have to fly off to Europe to get that international type of experience. There's a different cuisine. There's different culture. It's right here in our own backyard. And when you start to introduce the two, and they start to share, it's a really, really cool experience. So it's kind of like, before they get on a plane, they can actually do something here by driving by car and begin to get that taste of what international is like, and what it's like to meet and be a part of a different culture, because it's so exciting. The food is just fantastic. When we're looking for new things to try, it's just wonderful thing. And each Indigenous community is different.
Are there any more questions of John before I throw to Melissa? Yes, Rosalind. You'll have to come off mute, Rosalind. Hang on, I'll unmute you. There you go. You're unmuted,
Thank
Rosalind.
you. That's a new language of COVID-19. This just seems to be a wonderful way of a win-win situation for both the Indigenous people and the people of Australia. For too long, we've so-called helped, I think, by giving the Indigenous people what we think they want. This way, we're getting a lot in return, and it's a win-win for both parties. And what it means is that there's pride and respect on both sides, and that's a really positive thing, I think. So that's a comment, not a question.
Thanks, Rosalind.
My question
Say a little something to back that up, Rosalind.
Oh, she's got the question following. Hang on.
Sorry.
Distance seems to me that it could be a significant problem in Australia, partnering, say, with some of the Indigenous communities. How do you counter that in Canada?
So, I'll talk about Ontario. Down on southern Ontario, there are Indigenous communities that are far better off than the isolated communities that are in the north. There are over 60 isolated communities. There are no roads into these Indigenous communities, and so the way that they get their supplies is often by plane. And those tend to need more of the assistance in support, but still balancing that balance of relationship approach. And so obviously technology makes a big difference. We've worked towards helping facilitate getting better internet connections, like satellite internet connections, into some of these communities. We work on logistics challenges, and the logistics challenges don't just help those Indigenous communities, they also help a lot of our isolated non-Indigenous communities as well. So we try to work in partnership to solve some of these challenges. We have lots of resources down south, not so much at the Rotary clubs up north. And so we have that partnership between Southern Rotary clubs and Northern Rotary clubs as well, beginning to form. And so it's just this network of people beginning to work on a shared problem together to be able to solve that. Communication definitely can be a challenge, absolutely. In the case of the robotics, for example, the students down here now, after visiting Moose Factory, meet weekly by Zoom with the students up there, and they continue to work on robotics together. And the goal that they have for themselves, unfortunately COVID hit, the goal they do have is that they want to compete in a robotics competition together as one team, which is really
fantastic.
cool. So I'm hoping to see that story continue.
All right, now look, I'm conscious of time. Is there any last question before I throw to
But please, provide my contact information and
Thank you,
reach
John.
out to me whenever you have another question later on, because I know sometimes they don't come right away, but please always reach out to me.
Okay. Now, for those who are wondering, HIP Australia meet on the first Thursday of the month. And you can reach out to myself or Melissa, and we will make sure you get an access to the Zoom link at the moment. Now, Melissa, there's a number of things. So HIP is still forming at the moment, and many of you know that Melissa was also involved in the End Trachoma project. And John, you've heard that the End Trachoma, Australia is one of the only countries, if not the only country in the world, that still has this disease, and it is rife, unfortunately, in our Indigenous people. So, Melissa, is there something I think you would like to say regarding HIP Australia and an End Trachoma linked initiative?
Well, you can see why I was so impressed when I was blown away when I saw the breakout session in Toronto and heard what the panel was saying. So I got in contact with, I think it was Chris Snyder, who put me on to John. But I've been trying to bring this to Australia because I just think we've got so much that's shared in our history that what's working in Canada, I'd love to see working here in Australia. And this developing of relationships is something that's so important. I think the understanding of what's been going on in our history and just starting to understand what's been happening, to build those relationships, to start to work together. I started working in the Trachoma project as our district champion, and one of the things that we've been doing is going into the communities where there is a lot of trachoma and getting a relationship developed in those communities and finding out what the community actually wants to, in terms of help to improve the hygiene there to stop trachoma. Trachoma is a bacteria and it infects eyes and it causes blindness. And we're trying to get rid of this. It's a very easy disease to get rid of, but it's a disease of poor hygiene hardware and poor hygiene infrastructure. So there's lots of things we've been doing to work with the communities. Some of them, some of the communities say, well, we need help. We need a laundry here. We don't have a laundry and it's hard for people to launder things like blankets and sheets. Others say we need more help with having more toilets here, or to have better access to water when we have sorry days where there's a funeral and people come in from over a large distance and camp for quite a few days or even weeks, and the local town's hygiene infrastructure just can't cope with the number of people for that time. So portable water tanks and portable toilets have been brought in as part of our End Trachoma programs. And at the moment, some of the schools have started requesting hygiene packs because it's very difficult to get hold of hygiene items. So full-size shampoos and conditioners and toothpastes and things like that are extremely expensive up on community. And where it might cost us, a couple of dollars for a tube of toothpaste, it might be about $10 up there if it's available at all. So to support the school children with hygiene packs, there's been a call from the schools in Northern Territory to try and have these hygiene packs come up. I've got a slide and I'm not sure whether it will be able to be shown, but the schools up there, there's 2,000 students who would like to, no, I don't think it's there. They would like to access, they'd like to join with the schools in Australia and build relationships with them. And we're trying to get the various Rotary clubs to be involved in being part of this hygiene kit project where they build hygiene kits, but they also link in with their local schools. And the local school children build relationships with the schools where the hygiene kits will go. So they can start to do things like what John's been talking about. I think we'd like to see an exchange of students in the future, where the students from a remote Northern Territory community might come down to a student in somewhere like Beechworth or Millawa or Sunbury, and they can start to see what life's like down here. But the children in our communities down here can go up to those schools as well and have an idea of what life's like up in the Northern Territory, and they can have a lot of sharing of knowledge and experiences. So it's building relationships is something that our Trachoma project has been really focusing on. And with the project about to finish at the end of this Rotary year, we don't want to just abandon the relationships which we've already built. And we just don't want to end Trachoma, walk away from the communities and have nothing more to do with them. So we want to keep those relationships going, and we want to build on them. But we also want to build on relationships that are in our local communities as well. And Trachoma is looking at HIP as being a way of continuing those relationships and expanding on that and doing more. So yes, that's sort of where we are at the moment, is a sort of a transitioning, trying to get HIP coming, the Trachoma coming across and becoming HIP, and continuing relationships that have already been built.
Wonderful, thank you, Melissa. Look, I know a lot of time we've taken